Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation of our paper Ethermal, Lightweight Thermal Feedback for Virtual Reality Games. The goal of this work was to build and evaluate a low-cost system to convey temperature information to players without actually interfering with game controllers. My name is Günther Wallner and I'm happy to present this work today on behalf of my co-authors Bas Pleiner and Regina Bernhaupt. One of the major benefits of virtual reality lies in its ability to increase presence, and as such, much work is focused on increasing presence further by making virtual objects look and sound believable. This included different tactile approaches that, for example, let us feel the surface structure of objects. Thermal feedback, which communicates information about temperatures to players, has however been less explored to date. At least many of the proposed approaches are impractical to be used in games because they have not been designed with the simultaneous use of game controllers in mind. And as such, many of these solutions interfere with the handling of controllers due to being technologically too complex or being too bulky. To address this, we designed Ethermal, thermal feedback globes that were designed specifically to be used with games. With Ethermal, our aim was to create a cheap and easy to assemble system which does not require a lot of setup and only uses off-the-shelf technology. At the same time, it should still offer satisfying thermal feedback to players, and it should remain versatile so that it can be used for different interactions within a game. In particular, it should be able to be used to enhance presence and game experience by supporting interactions that invite exploration of the virtual world by simulating thermal changes in that environment, by enhancing interactions, by acting upon items which can be picked up and can be held in the hand of the player's avatar, and by supporting interactions that are novel and would not be possible without thermal feedback at all. Technically, Ethermal works in the following way. A so-called Peltier element, that is an element which converts electricity into temperature, is placed at the base of the thumb together with a heatsink. We actually experimented with different locations such as other fingers, the palm of the hand or the wrist, but these either interfered too strongly with holding the controller or were perceived as being unpleasant. In addition, previous research has also found that the base of the thumb has high temperature sensitivity and can register very small temperature changes. And that's why we opted for the base of the thumb in the end. This element is then held to the hand by a 3D printed frame and elastic straps that can be adjusted to fit different hand sizes. Wires connect the globes with an Arduino, which is used to control the temperature changes, and which is in turn connected to a PC. The change in temperature was limited to ±2 degrees Celsius for safety reasons, and the cold pulse lasts a bit longer than the hot one, and after each hot pulse, a 3-second cool down period was added to prevent the system from overheating. To evaluate our prototype, we then conducted a user study to explore first if users actually like the location of the thermal feedback at the base of the thumb. Second, if people prefer thermal feedback over visual gameplay cues or vice versa. Third, which kind of interactions with thermal feedback they prefer and for what interactions players propose to use it for. And lastly, if the prototype is actually able to increase presence. For the study, we created a dedicated virtual environment which supported two conditions, with and without thermal feedback. In the thermal condition, the environment included 4 different objects, which either provided warm or cold feedback, while in a non-thermal condition, these objects did not provide any temperature feedback. 3 of the objects provided environmental cues, while one was directly integrated into a gameplay mechanic. For the game-related one, the temperature was replaced by color cues in the non-thermal condition. Looking a bit more closely at the different objects, the first object the player encounters is a river. And once the player enters the river, cold feedback is provided by the gloves. On the other side of the river, the player will then find a campfire. And when the player is getting closer to the fire, the device becomes warmer to simulate the act of warming hands at the fireplace. Next, the player will find some snowballs which can be thrown at different targets and which, unlike the previous two, can actually be picked up. And once grabbed, the gloves become colder to simulate the cold snow in the player's hand. Lastly, the player has to play a game of the traditional children's game Hot and Cold, where the player has to find different trophies hidden within the environment and where the distance to them is indicated through getting warmer or getting colder feedback. In the children game, this feedback is made verbally. In our case, the feedback is provided through temperature in the thermal condition when the player pushes a specific button. And if the player gets close to the trophy, warm feedback is provided. If the player moves away, cold feedback is offered. In the non-thermal condition, the distance is indicated by colors instead. The study itself first started with informing the participant about the purpose of the study and obtaining their consent. Next, the participant had to fill a short demographic questionnaire, mainly asking about age, gender, as well as how often they play 3D and VR games. Afterward, the participant was instructed to put on the VR headset and the controllers. And after explaining the controls, the participant could walk through the environment, encountering the objects in the order I mentioned on the previous slide. Once finished with the non-thermal condition, the participant had to fill a post-experience survey consisting of the eye group presence questionnaire. Next, the thermal condition was experienced by the participant, after which they had to fill again the eye group presence questionnaire, and this time also the system usability scale. And lastly, a semi-structured interview took place. In total, 10 participants between 23 and 31 years of age took part in the study. One participant was female and 9 participants were male, and all participants indicated to have rarely used virtual reality technology before. In terms of results, I can't go through all the findings today in detail, but I would like to highlight some of them in the following. In general, the usability of the system scored a good on average on the system usability scale, and all participants also liked the location of the thermal feedback at the base of the thumb very much. For instance, one participant thought that it was
very good. I don't know why, but it worked very well. It feels like the right feedback, even though it is only in the palm of your hands.
However, participants also suggested ways to further improve it, for instance, by also offering feedback on the neck or at least on the back of the hand. With respect to whether participants prefer thermal or visual cues as part of a gameplay mechanic, half of the participants preferred the thermal feedback in the hot and cold game. The main reason for this preference was that they did not have to constantly look at the in-game interface, which was showing the color feedback, and could thus rather focus on their task. This is, for instance, nicely reflected in this quote from a participant who commented that
it's a lot more convenient. It makes a lot more sense cause your task is to find trophies and having temperature to tell you whether you are closer or farther away. You don't snap out of your task. You don't have to look at the thing.
However, 3 of the participants instead preferred the color feedback because it was clearer and faster to them. For instance, one participant complained
I stand still for a moment anyway when I think about what way I should go, but now I had to wait until I felt the right temperature. The color feedback was instant.
The other participants did not express a clear preference for either interaction. In terms of preferred interactions, 7 out of our 10 participants thought that the interaction with the water was actually the best. For most of them, the main reason was that it was realistic in some sense, with one participant commenting that it was
Unexpected, it felt like a sort of logical surprise. I just entered cold water. That must feel cold.
The preference for using temperature for environmental cues is also reflected when we ask participants about the interactions they could imagine they could use such feedback for, with participants again primarily focusing on making the virtual environment itself more immersive. Lastly, in terms of presence, the thermal feedback has led to an increase in spatial presence, experienced realism, as well as general presence. Although one should also keep the small sample size in mind here. Involvement did not show significant differences, which could have been also caused by the researcher providing instructions to the participants during the VR experience itself. But overall, these results here are really promising. So to slowly wrap up this talk, we can conclude that convincing thermal feedback for VR games can actually also be achieved at low cost. However, there is a trade-off between the experience created by thermal feedback and its efficiency when used as part of a gameplay mechanic. Because thermal feedback has a delay which may slow down the player, and as such environmental cues might perhaps be the more appropriate application of such type of feedback. Also because temperatures can be difficult to interpret, and therefore temperature feedback is more vague than feedback, for example, provided visually. And that's it for me for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take questions.